So, a couple of days ago, Sleeping Warrior cancelled his own number one proof, and he probably didn't even realise it himself. Such is the arrogance of this current flerf, who has not only won, but been nominated for this award right here many times, that he still won't realise just how badly he cancelled his own famous George Musa quote.
Gravity is not a force, but you can think of it as a force. Now, literally, it's not a force.
Let me remind you what was said. Gravity is not a force, but you can think of it as a force. Now, to Sleepy Warrior, aka Anthony Riley, this was music to his little ears, as he thought he had debunked all of science and gravity in general with this one statement. He believed that he was now the most famous scientist of our time, taken to wearing white coats as to portray some form of intellectual superiority.
This is an egg. This is a parts per million counter.
Off he went to the flat earth debates, and his sidekick and fellow nutjob Nathan Oakley just lapped up those lovely words, creating an entirely new narrative as to what gravity is, without understanding a single thing about it. So what happened a couple of nights ago? Well, Sleepy started to debate two highly qualified people, a PhD astrophysicist and a structural engineer. Essentially, he wasted 5 full hours with them telling him he is delusional and incorrect on everything, and he has turned it around, suggesting that it is them who are not scientists and don't know as much as he does. Let's take a listen to what Riley had to say about it on Nathan Oakley's debates a couple of days ago.
Astronomy, cosmology, or astrophysics?
No, none of them can have actual legitimate scientific experiments, as I demonstrated with a brilliant guy. I was host on a channel last night. The channel was called, what was the name of it? Rob Parks. I don't want to glorify him in any way whatsoever, but he claims to be a PhD holding scientist, and he turns out he's an astronomer. And I basically spent 5 hours last night telling him what he thinks is science. Astronomy isn't science, and he shouldn't be telling people that it is science because it's not. Pointing out that he's not got any experiment, pointing out that he's not got any controlled variables, manipulated variables. He has got a DV, but he's got no IVs, no controls. He's just got speculative explanations like big black holes causing things and woo-woo science all causing stuff that he can model out. And it was 5 hours that I'll never get back, but I got to tell him for 5 hours that he's not a scientist. It's on the channel Rob Parks, his latest upload. Go and check it out and stick it on double speed. It's definitely interesting to listen to me telling him how much he doesn't have any science to support his delusion that he's a scientist. Very good.
For 5 hours?
Oh. Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, Anthony gave him therapy for 5 hours. Did you charge him?
No, but if you do it at double speed, it's only 2.5, and it doesn't sound as bad.
Yeah, but obviously he's in pain. You're challenging his worldview at a very fundamental level. You're challenging his credentials as a scientist at a very fundamental level. And obviously he's going to appeal that for as long as he feels this is fit. And did he get anywhere? Did he manage to win the appeals with you, or what? What was the score?
Well, he basically, in the end, he called me delusional, but his sidekick that was with him, a guy called Norman, he was a structural engineer. He got his certificates out for me and flopped them on his table so I could see his certificates, right? And he's a structural engineer, right? But I spent 10 minutes arguing with him whether or not pressure is a force. And I'm like, if I have to argue with structural engineers whether or not pressure is a force, we have a real problem with science, don't we? Because he couldn't accept that because pressure is equal to force over a given area. He couldn't accept that pressure was a force. And we argued so much. And it was like, in the end, I was like, look, if you've got a flat tire and you've got a fully pumped up tire, the fully pumped up tire is keeping the hub off the floor because of what force? And the answer is pressure. Now, I know within our side, we've got this topic about whether or not it's structural support or not. I'm not going to get into that, but I want to contrast it from their side, because within our side, you might argue that there appears to be a structural support, which I don't agree with. But on his side, the answer is clearly pressure. It's pressure that's holding the hub off the floor. And to argue for 10 minutes with somebody that's a structural engineer, whether or not pressure is causing the hub to remain off the floor and sit in the middle of the wheel or not when it's not flat, if that's the standard of science that we've got, we're dealing with morons. And there's no other way to describe it. That is what we're dealing with.
with them. You need to be able to get the sizes and the distances to be able to map it out the solar system the way the heliocentric model claims that it has done.
The Kepler's laws, you're right, Kepler's laws are proportionality. Basically, if written correctly, Kepler's law are the period of the planet divided by the period of the Earth squared equals the size of the planet's orbit divided by the size of the Earth's orbit cubed. So you're right. All Kepler's laws can tell you in and upon themselves are the relative sizes. But we have used the eclipse of Venus or the transit of Venus to determine the absolute distance to the sun from the Earth, which gives you one of those unknowns, and we know what the period of the Earth's orbit is because we can measure the day or the year. That gives you the other one, which then turns everything into absolutes.
So after hearing Riley brag about how things went, the part I took away from this was when Riley simply didn't understand that pressure is not a force, but you can think of it as a force. You see, pressure is force divided by area. Riley then treats the pressure value as a force. But pressure is a measurement of the force applied perpendicular to the surface of an object per unit area, over which that force is distributed. It itself is not the force. Riley says that putting air in a tyre and inflating it displaces the position of the car by means of a force, so that pressure is now the force. Wrong. The tyre inflates because when the amount of gas molecules in the tyre has increased, there is more gas pushing against the surface area inside the tyre, and that force exerted across that area is creating the pressure. The tyre inflates because the pressure inside the tyre has changed. It has now not become a force, but the net result of this change creates an apparent force which moves the car. How is this so difficult for this numbskull to understand?
But I spent 10 minutes arguing with him whether or not pressure is a force. And I'm like, if I have to argue with structural engineers whether or not pressure is a force, we have a real problem with science, don't we? Because he couldn't accept that because pressure is equal to force over a given area, he couldn't accept that pressure was a force. And we argued so much. And it was like, in the end, I was like, look, if you've got a flat tyre and you've got a fully pumped up tyre, the fully pumped up tyre is keeping the hub off the floor because of what force? And the answer is pressure.
So, analogy for analogy, the argument about F equals ma versus P equals F divided by A is exactly the same. Just as when globers and scientists have been trying to explain to the flerfs that gravity itself is not a force, but you can think of it as one. By Riley taking this stance he has in regards to this pressure argument, he has in effect jumped on the gravity explanation and he didn't even realise it. He literally cancelled his own best argument when he thought he could outsmart two far more qualified and intellectually superior people. Well done, Riley. You might even get another award this year for this monumental screw-up. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all in the next one.